Hi everyone, and welcome to the Office of Online Learning Training, continuing talking about discussion boards. Today, we're going to talk about setting expectations and rubrics to facilitate the grading and rollout of your discussion boards. So here are the goals. I want to share some discussion board grading examples for you, different ways that you can set up the discussion board to best facilitate your course content and the purpose behind the discussion board, which we talked about in the first video. And I also wanted to give some examples of instructor feedback and categorize what type of feedback you can provide for your students to guide their work and their learning. So just to review, again, it is so important to set the expectations for your discussion board and really go back again to that essential learning and think about what is it do I want my students to get out of this discussion board, and how are they showing their learning? So really being clear about what you want them to do, transparent about what you expect them to get out of the discussion board and why, and modeling that expected behavior. And I find that has been really helpful for me to, when I insert myself in the discussion board, that I'm modeling some aspect that I want them to do, whether it's asking an effective follow-up question or summarizing. And that's what I've really set out for myself, which I'll share some examples of faculty feedback in a little bit. But I've really given myself a purpose when I go into my class discussion boards to say, I want to model a good follow-up question because my students had difficulty with that last time. So really thinking about setting a purpose for yourself as you investigate and check in on the Blackboard discussions, just so that you can set some direction so you're not just sitting there for hours looking at discussion board posts. So here are some options for grading. And again, there are lots of options for you. I'm going to share what has worked best for me in the past, but here are just some options. So a rubric provides very clear expectations. You can have a holistic rubric or have more of an analytic rubric. I will share the example that I've worked on with you on the next slide, just to kind of give an example. You can grade your students qualitatively and quantitatively, so looking at the quality of their posts, did they include the content that you were looking for, and also then looking at the frequency of their posts. You can choose one, you can choose both. So again, really going back and thinking about what's the purpose of the discussion board. For me, I've really found that I want my discussion boards to demonstrate a student's ability to apply the content that we've introduced. If they read about a strategy, I want them to be able to apply it to a case study. So I do use a combination of qualitative and quantitative. I want them to have a high quality post with good content, but then I also want to see a back and forth with some other students, or at least one, so that they can have that collective learning together. You can also have an option for low stakes or even no grading. I do have a discussion board in my courses that is just an ask the instructor or a questions for the whole that has no grading whatsoever, and the students can just ask questions generally to the whole group if they have any concerns. But you can also set up a discussion board that might just be a discussion of an article that the class read that really is low stakes or that isn't graded at all. Another option is binary grading, so students get credit just for participating. So they get a 1 for participating and posting, and they get a 0 for not posting. So it's very simplistic, really kind of looking at, are you engaging in our learning community? Are you participating? Versus really analyzing that content of the post. And then another concept which I think is really great is giving students that self-care pass, right? So if you have decided that discussion boards are very important and integral into your course, and maybe you have 5 discussion boards across your 16 weeks or across your course, you might consider giving students a self-care pass where 1 week, everyone knows that life happens, and so maybe they're not having a great week or something comes up, they can use a self-care pass. So essentially, 1 discussion board post or 1 thread is dropped for them. And so really kind of thinking, again, this all goes back to, what is the purpose of the discussion board and how it's supporting students. But when you look at the self-care pass, it helps with student engagement. If we look back for universal design for learning, right, kind of showing our students that we understand where they're coming from, but really also then providing very clear expectations for their grading does help with engagement, because now our students know exactly what we're expecting as instructors, and in this online environment, they might not be making that individual personal connection as easily with us. So providing these expectations explicitly is just very helpful. So here's an example of my rubric that I use in my discussion board. So this is an evolution of many different samples from online that I've used. I'm really focusing on the social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence, which is research that has been existing in online learning for a long time. But I really try and provide some specific examples as to what I am talking about for social presence in the proficient column, and then I consistently try and refer back to the rubric when I'm giving feedback for my students. And what I try and do is when I'm inserting myself into the discussion boards, I try and make sure I'm modeling at least all three, if not one of these, to then demonstrate to my students. Or what I will do is when I'm grading them, I'll say, you know what, why don't you go back and look at my discussion post from week 3. It was a model of cognitive presence where I summarized what was happening in the course and then kind of clarified a misconception for another student. What I've also found really helpful, as I mentioned previously, is thinking about the purpose of my engagement and my feedback. And this has really helped me to conceptualize the workload of discussion boards and not feeling like I need to read every single discussion post, especially if I have a large class. As previously mentioned, if you have small group discussions in your on-the-ground class, you're not always monitoring every single conversation. You're checking in. And so this really kind of helped me to, again, conceptualize what is the purpose of my feedback and what am I doing here. So oftentimes I find I'm providing this Socratic feedback, kind of trying to probe for deeper learning and fostering that critical thinking. But sometimes I'm also providing that informative content, feedback or corrective, and sometimes I'm just providing a general, almost administrative support for students, or providing that emotional. And I think that's something that's also really important, and that often that's the purpose that the discussion board might be filling in our classroom, is building that learning community and building some of those personal and emotional connections between us and our students that might not be happening with a single admission assignment that we might have. So next is I wanted to provide some examples of feedback that I've given in discussion boards. And what I often do, and I highly recommend this strategy, is if I see that many students are struggling with a similar area or the same content, I'll make a note to myself to give feedback to the whole class in the general areas of, I think we could work on this, or there might be some misconceptions about this aspect of the rubric or of the content. But what I also do is I copy and paste my comments that I'm giving individually to students in a separate document. It really allows me to cut down on some of my time, because if there is a theme, if I have some students who are having difficulty, bringing in an additional resource, right? So looking at that cognitive presence. So for many of my students, I ask, above the textbook, I want you to then add in another resource that you found online to our discussion. And so what I can then do is take maybe this second sentence and copy and paste it. So it really just cuts down on my time. That's been a strategy that is really helpful for me. It also then allows me to see those emerging themes of, wow, many students had difficulty with this. So here's an example of some corrective feedback. I'm giving the student, a positive comments about what they were able to do, and then also giving them feedback how to improve their score for the next discussion board that we have. In this next example, this is more the Socratic feedback. So I'm really trying to promote more critical thinking. So the student did a great job on their discussion board. However, I still want them to dig deeper, right? So kind of always trying to probe them to push themselves more into the content. And so here, what I then push them to do is think about the content from a different perspective. So if they were really engaging well with the question that I gave them, I encouraged them to take the opportunity to look at it from a different lens. And so here again, some general tips when it comes to grading and setting expectations. I really do try to focus, especially on the first discussion board if I have multiple, to provide some good feedback on the expectations. It's really setting the tone, right? As to what do I want from my students. And I often find that if I have some really comprehensive good feedback, then my students will perform better in the next discussion board because they've learned from that experience. What works well for me is using the rubric, and it's really finding what works well for you as you're implementing discussion boards. So I do like providing that personalized feedback. I highly recommend, as I mentioned, having that document for yourself so that you can have the comments that maybe are frequently used comments, or maybe just an example of that Socratic feedback. If you have a lot of students who did well, really just encouraging them to dig a little bit deeper. I do like also giving that whole class feedback. So if you have a huge class and that personalized feedback for discussion boards is really cumbersome, you can really provide a whole class feedback. In general, everyone did summarized the reading really well and reflected based on our case study. However, remember, responding back to someone's follow-up questions really helps to keep the discussion going. And so really kind of thinking about how you can provide that whole class feedback. And I want to really hit home that you can't monitor everything. It can be a very overwhelming thing to feel like you need to monitor every single post. What I've also really found, and this has been important for me in my design, is that this feedback does truly support student learning. And what I've done is I've decreased the amount of discussion boards that I'm using in my classes to really make sure that the content that I'm choosing to deliver through a discussion board, right, that essential learning is very clear for my students. That drastically helps my student engagement in looking at universal design because they're not overwhelmed by the amount of discussion boards that they have. Since I decreased that, it really has helped me to give some more personalized and meaningful feedback to further my students' learning. And that's one of the big takeaways that you can take from looking at grading discussion boards is really pulling together what you truly want students to get out of the discussion board, that essential learning, being very clear in your expectations as to how the students will be graded, and then giving them feedback so that it was a true learning experience to continue with that engagement.